The restaurant buzzed with the usual lunchtime crowd, and Sarah, a young waitress with a sharp tongue, was rushing between tables. She prided herself on being quick-witted, always ready with a joke or a sarcastic remark. Most customers laughed it off. But today she had no idea who had just walked through the door. An older man in a simple button-down shirt and jeans took a seat in her section. He had a weathered face, a quiet confidence, and piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything without saying much. He didn't demand attention, but something about him was undeniably familiar. Sarah approached his table, not bothering to hide her impatience. "What can I get you, old-timer?" she asked, smirking. The man glanced up at her and gave a small chuckle. "Just a black coffee," he said in a low, steady voice. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, live a little. We've got lattes, cappuccinos, all that fancy stuff. I'll stick with black," the man said simply. She shrugged and walked off. As she returned with the coffee, she noticed a group of customers whispering and glancing toward the man's table. Curious, she lingered nearby and caught part of their conversation. "That's Clint Eastwood," one of them whispered. "I swear it is." Sarah nearly dropped the coffee pot. She glanced back at the man. Now it made sense, the strong jaw, the unmistakable presence, but instead of feeling awed, she scoffed. "Clint Eastwood? Please," she said, loud enough for the man to hear. "He's ancient. He's probably lost in here thinking it's the Wild West." The table of customers went silent, and the older man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He took a slow sip of his coffee, unfazed. A few moments later, the restaurant manager rushed out from the back looking panicked. "Sarah," he hissed. "Come here now." Confused, she followed him to the side. "What?" she asked, annoyed. Her manager looked like he was about to faint. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Sarah crossed her arms. "Yeah, some guy who thinks he's Clint Eastwood." The manager wiped his forehead. "No, that is Clint Eastwood, and he owns this restaurant." Sarah's stomach dropped. She slowly turned back toward the table. The man, Clint Eastwood, was calmly finishing his coffee, clearly aware of what was happening. Summoning her courage, she walked back over, forcing an awkward smile. Sir, sorry about that. I didn't realize who you were." Clint set his coffee cup down and looked up at her with a slight grin. "No harm done," he said. "But you might want to work on your customer service. You never know who might be watching." Sarah swallowed hard. "Right. Yes. Absolutely." Clint pulled a few bills from his pocket and set them on the table. As he stood up, he gave her a small nod and walked out, leaving the entire restaurant in stunned silence. As soon as the door shut behind him, Sarah exhaled. She had just insulted a Hollywood legend and her own boss. Lesson learned. The moment Clint Eastwood walked out the door, the restaurant remained eerily quiet. A few customers whispered among themselves, replaying what had just happened. Sarah, still frozen in place, felt her stomach twist into knots. Her manager shot her a look of pure disbelief. "Sarah, do you realize how lucky you are?" She frowned. "Lucky? I just embarrassed myself in front of Clint Eastwood and my boss, the wow." Manager shook his head. "Exactly. You should be grateful he's not the type to fire people on the spot. If that had been anyone else with his level of power, you'd be out of a job before your next shift." Sarah swallowed hard, the reality sinking in. She had insulted one of Hollywood's biggest legends, a man who could have easily had her fired, with a snap of his fingers. Instead, he had just let it go. A customer from the nearby table chuckled. "You've got some nerve, kid. You just took a shot at the guy who played Dirty Harry and lived to tell the tale." Another diner nodded. "Yeah, but did you see his face?" He was amused. "I bet he gets that kind of thing all the time." Sarah sighed and ran a hand through her hair. I don't know whether to feel relieved or horrified. The rest of her shift dragged on, but she couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Every time the door opened, she flinched, half expecting Clint to walk back in with some kind of payback plan. But he never returned. By the end of the night, as she clocked out, she made a promise to herself. No more sarcastic remarks at customers' expense. She had learned her lesson the hard way. The next morning, she arrived at work early, still feeling nervous. As she tied her apron and got ready for the day, the manager approached her with a strange expression. "You got a message," he said, handing her a small envelope. Sarah's heart pounded as she opened it. Inside was a neatly folded note written in strong, bold handwriting. "Kid, next time, lighten up on the old-timer jokes. Some of us are still faster on the draw than you think. Clint." Taped to the bottom of the note was a crisp $100 bill. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. A slow smile spread across her face. She had insulted Clint Eastwood, and not only had he not fired her, he had left her a tip. She shook her head, laughing to herself. Clint Eastwood really was the coolest man alive. The note and the crisp $100 bill sat in Sarah's hands for a long moment as she processed what had just happened. Of all the possible outcomes, this was the last thing she had expected. Instead of anger or revenge, Clint Eastwood had left her with a lesson, delivered in the coolest way possible. Her manager smirked. "Looks like you just got a personal life lesson from Clint Eastwood himself. Not many people can say that." Sarah exhaled and shook her head. "Yeah, and I'd rather not make a habit of it." She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket. She wasn't going to spend the money, no way. That bill, along with the note, was going straight into a frame. The rest of the day, she felt like a celebrity in the restaurant. Customers who had witnessed the incident the day before kept bringing it up. "Hey, waitress, any more wisecracks for Hollywood legends today?" one guy teased. Another customer grinned. "I can't believe you had the guts to mouth off to Clint Eastwood. That takes nerve." Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled. Yeah, laugh it up. I've learned my lesson." Despite the teasing, she felt something unexpected. Respect. The moment that could have ended her job had somehow turned into the best work story she'd ever have. Later that evening, as she wiped down tables after closing, she found herself replaying the moment over and over. She had misjudged Clint Eastwood, thinking he was just some grumpy old guy. But in reality, he had been patient, cool, and even humorous about the whole thing. He could have humiliated her, fired her, or even just scolded her. But instead, he had turned it into a moment of wisdom. As she locked up for the night, Sarah pulled the note from her pocket one last time and read it again. She couldn't help but smile. From that day on, she treated every customer with a little more respect, because as Clint Eastwood had reminded her, you never know who might be watching. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became something of a local legend. Regular customers would come in, point at her, and whisper about the waitress who smart-mouthed Clint Eastwood and lived to tell the tale. Some even asked for her to serve them, hoping to witness another sharp-tongued moment, though she had since learned to keep her wit in check. One evening, an older couple sat down at one of her tables, smiling knowingly. The man leaned in and said, "So what's it like being Clint Eastwood's favorite waitress?" Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "I wouldn't say favorite, more like most reckless." The woman grinned. "Oh, honey, if he took the time to leave you a note and a tip, trust me, he liked you." Sarah shrugged but couldn't help but feel a little proud. Maybe, in some strange way, she had earned Clint Eastwood's respect. One afternoon, just as the lunch rush was winding, down the door swung open and every conversation in the restaurant seemed to pause. A familiar figure strolled in, his presence commanding attention without him having to say a word. Clint Eastwood was back. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but this time, she didn't panic. Instead, she grabbed a coffee cup and walked right up to his table. "Black coffee, right?" she asked, setting it down before he could even say a word. Clint looked up at her, his lips twitching into a smirk. "You catch on quick, kid," she grinned, crossing her arms. "Well, I figured if I got it wrong again, you might leave me a whole lecture this time." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, just another $100. The whole restaurant erupted in laughter. Sarah laughed too, shaking her head as she walked away. From that day on, Clint Eastwood became a semi-regular at the restaurant, always sitting in Sarah's section, always ordering the same black coffee. And while she still had her wit, she knew when to use it and when to show a little respect. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was this: legends don't need to demand respect, they just earn it. And Clint Eastwood? He had earned it without even trying. Over time, Clint Eastwood's occasional visits became the highlight of Sarah's shifts. Each time he walked in, the restaurant staff exchanged knowing glances, and customers whispered excitedly. But for Sarah, it became something more: a quiet mentorship, a rare and unexpected friendship with a living legend. She never pried into his life, and he never demanded anything special. He would come in, order his black coffee, and sip it slowly, while observing the world around him. Some days he would make small talk, asking Sarah about her day or what was new in town. Other days he would just sit in comfortable silence, his mere presence enough to make the entire restaurant feel different. One afternoon, as she refilled his coffee, Clint glanced up at her with his usual sharp, unreadable expression. "You still got that note I left you?" he asked. Sarah smiled, nodding. "Framed it, hung it up in my apartment." He chuckled. "Good. Don't forget the lesson that came with it." She shook her head. "I won't. Trust me, I've learned to watch my mouth." Clint smirked. "Nah, don't stop being yourself, just know when to pull the trigger and when to keep the safety on." Sarah let those words sink in. Somehow he always had a way of saying things that stuck with her. It wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about life. About knowing when to speak up and when to stay quiet. When to stand your ground and when to let things go. One day, after months of seeing him regularly, Clint didn't show up. A week passed. Then two. Sarah started to wonder if he had just moved on to another town, another favorite spot. Then one evening, she saw the news. Clint Eastwood had officially retired from public life, choosing to spend his remaining years in quiet solitude. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for the time she had shared with him, sadness that she might never see him again, and a deep respect for the man who had unknowingly changed her outlook on life. The next day, she walked into work with a different kind of energy. She didn't see her job the same way anymore. It wasn't just about serving food or making tips, it was about the people, the stories, the lessons hidden in everyday moments. And as she wiped down the table where Clint Eastwood used to sit, she smiled to herself, knowing that, in some small way, she had been lucky enough to be part of his story, just as he had become a part of hers. As the months passed, Sarah continued working at the restaurant, but something inside her had shifted. She carried herself with a quiet confidence now, knowing that one of the coolest men to ever walk the earth had given her a lesson she'd never forget. One evening, as she was cleaning up after closing time, the manager approached her with an envelope in his hand. "This came in for you today," he said, handing it over. Sarah furrowed her brows. "For me?" She carefully opened it and found a handwritten note inside. The handwriting was familiar, strong, bold, and unmistakably Clint Eastwood's. "Kid, I may not be stopping by for coffee anymore, but I figure you've got things handled. Keep your head up, keep your wit sharp, and remember, sometimes the best shots are the ones you don't take. Cheers, Clint." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. There was no return address, no fanfare, just a simple, powerful message from a man who had already taught her so much. As she turned the note over, she noticed something else tucked inside: a gift card to a well-known film school. Her eyes widened. She had mentioned in passing once that she loved movies and always wanted to learn more about filmmaking, but she never thought much of it. Yet somehow, Clint had remembered. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she laughed softly, shaking her head. Of course, Clint Eastwood wouldn't just say goodbye and disappear. He had to leave behind one final lesson. That night, she made a decision. She was going to chase her dreams, push herself beyond her comfort zone, and see where life took her. And as she locked up the restaurant one last time, she took a deep breath, knowing that no matter where she went, she'd always carry a piece of Clint Eastwood's wisdom with her. A few weeks later, Sarah packed her bags and moved to a new city, Determined to make the most of the unexpected opportunity Clint Eastwood had left her. She enrolled in film school, balancing classes with part-time work at another restaurant. But this time, she approached everything with a new mindset, one shaped by the quiet wisdom of a man who had once been just another customer at her table. At school, she quickly developed a passion for storytelling, realizing that the same sharp wit that had once gotten her into trouble could now be used to craft scripts and characters with depth and humor. She found herself drawn to classic cinema, studying Clint's films with fresh eyes, seeing the nuances in his performances and the mastery behind his direction. One day, a professor assigned a project: create a short film that tells a meaningful story. Sarah knew immediately what hers would be about. She wrote, directed, and starred in a short film titled The Regular, a heartfelt, fictionalized version of her encounter with Clint Eastwood. It was a simple yet powerful story about a waitress who unknowingly insults a quiet, legendary figure, only to learn a lesson that changes her perspective on life forever. When the film screened in class, the response was overwhelming. Her peers laughed, teared up, and applauded. Even her professor was impressed. "This," he said, "feels like something Eastwood himself would appreciate." Encouraged by the reaction, Sarah submitted The Regular to a small film festival. To her shock, it was accepted. A few months later, she sat in a packed theater as the lights dimmed and her film played on the big screen. Watching her story unfold, she felt a wave of gratitude, not just for the experience itself, but for the man who had unknowingly set it all in motion. As the credits rolled, she glanced down at the note Clint had left her, which she now carried in her wallet. She traced the familiar words with her finger, smiling to herself. She would never see him again, never get to thank him in person. But she had a feeling that, somewhere out there, Clint Eastwood would have watched her film, given a slow nod, and said in that signature voice of his, "Not bad, kid." The success of The Regular at the small film festival was just the beginning. Word spread about the young filmmaker who had turned a chance encounter with Clint Eastwood into a heartfelt, compelling short film. Industry professionals took notice, and soon Sarah found herself invited to more events, networking with directors, writers, and producers who saw something special in her storytelling. One evening, at a larger festival where The Regular was being screened, a well-known film executive approached her after the showing. "That was impressive," he said, shaking her hand. "Simple yet powerful. You've got an eye for storytelling." Sarah smiled, still a little overwhelmed by all the attention. "Thank you. Honestly, I just wanted to honor a lesson that meant a lot to me." The executive nodded. "And you did. I'd love to talk about what's next for you." That conversation led to her first real job in the industry, a chance to work on a major film set as a production assistant. It was the lowest rung on the ladder, but Sarah didn't care. She was in. She was finally doing what she had only dreamed of a year ago. As she worked her way up, she kept Clint's note framed on her desk, a reminder of where it all started. She often found herself thinking about his words, especially on tough days, when she questioned whether she was good enough. Years passed, and Sarah moved from small projects to bigger ones. Eventually, she got the chance to direct her first feature film. When the press asked about her inspirations, she always mentioned Clint Eastwood, not just for his films, but for the personal impact he had on her life. One day, while attending an industry gala, she overheard a conversation between two veteran actors reminiscing about Clint Eastwood's legacy. "He had an eye for talent," one of them said. "Always knew who had potential, even if they didn't see it in themselves." Sarah smiled at that, because somehow in the most unexpected way he had seen something in her too. When her first film premiered, she saved a seat in the theater, empty but reserved. It was her way of honoring the man who had unknowingly set her on this path, and, as the lights dimmed and the screen lit up, she whispered under her breath, "This one's for you, Clint." Sarah's directorial debut was a success. Critics praised her ability to capture raw emotion on screen, and audiences connected with the authenticity of her storytelling. Offers started coming in, bigger projects, collaborations with top-tier actors, and even a potential deal to direct a major studio film. Despite the whirlwind of success, Sarah never let herself forget where she came from. She made it a point to treat everyone on set with the same respect Clint Eastwood had shown her that day in the restaurant. She knew what it felt like to be underestimated, and she vowed to create an environment where young, aspiring filmmakers could thrive. One afternoon, while reviewing a script in her office, her assistant walked in. "Sarah, you got a package. No return address." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't received anything mysterious in a long time. Carefully, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "You did good, kid." Clint. That was it. No long message, no explanation. Just a simple acknowledgement from the man who had started it all. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears and she let out a soft laugh. Even after all these years, he still had perfect timing. She framed the note next to the first one, placing them side by side in her office. They weren't just words. They were reminders of a journey she never could have predicted. And as she stepped onto the set of her next film, ready to call out action, she knew Clint Eastwood's lesson would live on, not just in her work, but in every person she inspired along the way.